Hello, and welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Damien is up this week, so what are you bringing to the table today?
Yes, it's me. It's my turn. All right. So today I've brought an article to the table for us called The Mantra of White Supremacy. Oof. Big name, right?
Yeah.
And it was written by our very good friend, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. As I think I mentioned last week, we are just big fans of him around here. But if you want to check it out, you can find it on The Atlantic, on their website. It was published back on November 30th. I would encourage folks to read it, partially because Dr. Kendi is just brilliant, I think. But basically, this piece really dived into and framed the whole concept of white supremacy through, I think, several contexts that I'm sure we'll talk about today in some way, shape, or form, right? Things like how we've seen white supremacy play out throughout this country's history, to what we're seeing right now with these misguided critiques and attacks on critical race theory and anti-racist education, right? And I think, and what all of this looks like and means in terms of the harm that white supremacy and sort of white supremacist ideology and what white supremacists really are doing to all of us and to this country. So I really enjoyed this article. I got a lot out of it. I think that Dr. Kendi made some outstanding points and connections between, history and present day manifestations of white supremacy. So, yeah, I've really been looking forward all week to talking about this with you.
Yes.
So, yeah, as I said, I think there's so much here. Where do you want to start, my friend?
Whew. Well, this article was a word and a half. There was a lot here, as you said. One of the things that I loved is that he brought in all of this history of folks who opposed the abolition of slavery, like people who were actively defending enslavement as an institution in this country, opponents to the civil rights movement, and how those groups and their arguments line up directly with like Christopher Rufo, who we've talked about, and more of these anti-critical race theory crusaders. How it lines up basically down to the word.
Yeah, right.
To the phrase, right? And so I think it's important that Dr. Kendi is naming that these arguments against critical race theory are white supremacist in and of themselves.
Yes.
Because they're founded in preventing anyone from learning about the real origins of racism. And all these arguments or perspectives are actually taken from and were cooked up originally by avowed white supremacists who believe that a cultural genocide against white people is happening. So I think it's really important that we name the origins of these current lines of arguments because they're becoming more and more mainstream, right?
Yeah.
Like they start on Tucker Carlson. Well, they started on, we're going to talk about him, Whitaker.
Yeah.
Wrote the mantra. So they start there and then they get pulled and adapted and circled through Stormfront and white supremacist websites. And eventually the ideas end up in, the water, so to speak.
In the water.
And we're hearing them spouted off all over the place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's like such a good point about sort of the importance of naming, like that these arguments, particularly against critical race theory, right, are just white supremacy in action, right? Like that's exactly what they are. And so I appreciate you saying that. I appreciated Dr. Kendi sort of calling it like it is, right?
Yep.
So a word and a half, as you said. Yeah. I think that was really one of the major takeaways from this article, right? Sort of the idea of how important it is to name white supremacy in all of its forms, right? In all of the ways that it shows up in people and our society, and sort of the idea of like how harmful and toxic sort of white supremacist ideology is, right? So, Dr. Kendi at one point in this piece talked about, when folks are referring to anti-racist as being code for anti-white, right? Like that's what that is. That's anti-supremacy. White supremacist ideology in full effect there, right? Or like what we're seeing in politics right now with voter suppression tactics, right? And the laws that are being enacted around the country, right? Or gerrymandering efforts taking place, right? In states across the country, right? And certainly with what we saw on like January 6th, right? With the insurrection. I think that insurrection in itself was a real sort of textbook example of white supremacy and sort of, the ideology in action, right? Just sort of on display. And so I really appreciated, I think, the question that Dr. Kendi asked in this article, and I think it also connects to something that you said, right? And so what he says is, how many Americans know that the claim that anti-racism is harmful to white people is one of the basic mantras of white supremacist ideology. Americans are familiar with white supremacist movements like the Klan, skinheads, neo-Nazis, and the Proud Boys, but they don't seem to recognize white supremacist ideology, the most venomous form of racist ideology. I suspect that many Americans don't know how much white supremacist ideology shapes their political thought and America's political discourse, and allows juries to exonerate racism and convict anti-racism. I had to stop in my tracks, right? That's a bold statement, but it's just all facts, right?
Yeah. I highlighted that part too when as I was reading. I was like, yep, this is all correct. And I think about the foundation. It's essentially the foundation for this whole fight against critical race theory in schools, or what's being framed in that way. It's a giant backlash of people who are trying to stop us from reckoning with the actual facts of history, that the U.S. was founded as a republic where not everybody was represented, and people were enslaved and not counted as a part of the population in the same way, and that women didn't have access to voting in the same way that men did, and people who didn't own land also didn't have it. So there are all these sort of caveats to what citizenship meant,
right?
And we don't want to recognize any of that now to see how that might also still be influencing things today. And so this is all like backlash to that. As we start to infuse more of that, I think, in sort of culturally and start to recognize that more broadly. We don't want to recognize the origins of the genocide.
Oh, I was just thinking about
right?
genocide.
The government intentionally committed against indigenous people. It was not accidental. And I know that we've talked about this, the things I just listed over the last several months, but I think it's crucial to continue to speak out about this, because right-wing governors across the country are still signing bills into law that prohibit teaching anything related to critical race theory. And broader than that, right? It's there's a whole list of topics that DeSantis just signed into law for Florida, and all that really does is further entrenches whiteness and white supremacy in our legal system. Thus, kind of proving the point for why we need critical race theory to be able to analyze like what it is that's happening and how it's happening. So this section or this quote, I think, is super important for us to kind of understand where these ideas coming from. I would also maybe push a little bit that I think we are generally familiar with white supremacist movements like the Klan, skinheads, neo-Nazis, and Proud Boys. I don't think that we know all that much about it, right? Like we know that they exist and we know some things that maybe they've done here and there, but we don't, we don't necessarily know what are the philosophies driving them, and like who is actually involved, right? Like, so I think that's a piece of that I'm like, I agree, and I have an asterisk maybe.
So you think there's some potential value in understanding a little bit more about these groups, the Klan, the skinheads, the neo-Nazis, the Proud Boys?
I think maybe it's not necessarily understanding more about them and what they do, but like what are the things that they're saying, and so then you can start to pull the threads together of how these things, how they're sort of related and connected. And so when they say that they're not racist, you can be like, well, no, yeah, you're saying the same thing that so and so said, and we know definitively that so and so was a racist, right?
Yes.
And so you can connect the dots,
Yes,
essentially.
absolutely.
So I don't think that we all need to be experts in these groups and what they do, but I think that we don't necessarily know a ton about them as sort of. I'm backing up his point that. We don't know the ideology.
Yeah.
We don't recognize the ideology, and I think if we did, we would know a lot more about who these groups are and what they're doing.
Absolutely. Well, and I think if we also knew more about their ideology, right? Sort of, he talks about, right, how much this ideology is shaping political thought, our political thought, and our country's political discourse, right? And so, my goodness, I think it's actually kind of scary to think about, right? Then we already see that this is a problem, right? But if I knew even more about it, like, right, that could be really more troubling than I can even imagine in this moment. So yeah, I see that. I appreciate that. Yeah, that section right there made the whole thing, in my opinion, this whole article a worthy read, sort of for that compelling quote and sort of line of thought alone. So I appreciated that. I also definitely wanted to talk about what Dr. Kendi specifically named as the mantras of white supremacy, right? Because I think I sort of knew that there was this actual thing out there called the mantra, but I to be honest, I didn't know some of the things that he wrote about in this piece, right? So the mantra itself, it was this screed or ranting by a white supremacist named Robert Whitaker. You mentioned him earlier, right?
Yeah.
And he was apparently an economics professor, an appointee by President Reagan to the Office of Personnel Management, who had been radicalized in opposition to the civil rights movement. So all that sort of happening around him, and he's vehemently opposed. And so towards the end of his life, he wrote the mantra, which it closes with this statement. They say they are anti-racist. What they are is anti-white. Anti-racist is a code for anti-white. And, powerful words, right? That clearly, I think, had an impact on white supremacists and their actions, right? And sort of are the base from which, like, this evolution of white supremacy we're seeing, and this emboldened white supremacy, right? We're seeing, like, I think about the insurrection as one example, right? It's like it's all stemming from that, right? And so, Dr. Kendi goes on in this piece to name, like, these atrocious terrorist acts that were committed by white supremacists over the last decade, right? And all of them are in some way linked to, or they name Whitaker's The Mantra as inspiration, right? So there was a terrorist attack back in 2011 in Norway that killed 77 people. There was Dylan Roof murdering those 9 black folks in Charleston, South Carolina back in 2015, right? And so, like, those things have some connections to Whitaker's writing. And you talked about Tucker Carlson earlier, right? Like, Dr. Kendi also made connections from the mantra to what Tucker Carlson talked about in all of his rants on his show about critical race theory this year. And so, I think as despicable as the mantra is, right, and all of this is, and I don't really particularly like talking about it, I see it sort of connects to your point earlier, right? I think it's important for us to understand it, to know that it's out there, that it exists, right? And we have to talk about what that means, both in the context of what you raised, but in the context of, what Dr. Kendi talked about as well, right?
Yeah, because, I think it's easy to, and this, I think, is a broadening of his point about white supremacist ideology. It's easy to think that white supremacy is only the Klan and the Proud Boys and those groups, when it's not, right? Yep. And this is what you said just a minute ago, is it's broader than that, and understanding all the ways that it is influencing our current political thought and all that stuff would be very challenging.
Yes,
I think, to a lot of us, collectively across the U.S. But yeah, I think about Tucker Carlson, and his rants against critical race theory, but also when he talks about immigration, I think there's some connections to this.
Yes.
In how he's framing his arguments against immigration or against refugees, helping refugees get back on their feet after whatever it is that they're running from, which is usually caused by imperialist actions taken by our government.
How about it? So there's some connections there.
There's
that
some
rhetoric,
connections
right?
there. Yeah.
That's a good point.
So yeah, I think as you mentioned, the mantra has been a leading philosophical structure for white supremacist violence. And as you pointed out from your quote from Dr. Kendi, we collectively don't notice these philosophies that perpetuate this violence, and it's now essentially being infused into our everyday lives, where we're seeing white people screaming at school board meetings, and laws being passed, and again, Tucker Carlson. I feel like if we read that quote from the mantra, they say they're anti-racist. What they are is anti-white. Anti-racist is a code word for anti-white. If we made a meme of that and put Tucker's name on it, like it would get eaten up.
Yeah.
One, and two, who would nobody would say
guess.
it wasn't him.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the things about Tucker Carlson that's so mind-boggling to me is that white supremacists love him.
Yeah.
Because he's doing stuff like this, and he's using these ideas in little ways in his show that are sort of a wink and a nod to these other ideas
on this mega platform.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, this is the philosophy that's underlying all this anti-critical race theory stuff, and broader than anti-critical race theory, because these attacks are bigger than that, right? Dr. Kendi, for example, is not a critical race theorist.
Right.
He's adjacent to that, but he's also a main target in a lot of these sort of laws and regulations around what can be taught and what can't be. This is just, really just a resistance. The process is a resistance to discuss anything regarding race. And this is kind of the philosophy that seems to be driving a lot of it.
Yeah. And that's what, to me, was so fascinating about this and learning about it, right? Because obviously we see it out there. We see what Tucker Carlson is saying. We see what you talked about DeSantis earlier, right? And all the rhetoric that's out there, right? And so just sort of read about the mantra itself, right? And to sort of see where it stems, where it all stems from. And you're right, sort of the connection in this rhetoric to other issues, also other social issues, right? But it's like this idea, I think you said this earlier, like the playbook, right? It's all the same playbook, right? And they're just recycling it, rewashing it, reusing it in all of these places. Yeah. So I that's was one of the big takeaways for me for this. There was something else that I figured you might have some thoughts on that Dr. Kendi talked about, and it was these two thoughts. He had these thoughts on these thoughts on these two different or conflicting mantras that Republicans and others have had in the decades since the civil rights movement, right? So the first mantra being that racism no longer exists, and the second being that racism is spreading against white people.
Yep.
And I really liked how he connected these mantras to white supremacist ideology and also to the concept of the zero sum myth, right? That Heather McGhee talked about in her book, which is called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together.
Which is a great book.
It's a great book. This year. It's a great book, right? And so for folks who are unfamiliar, this zero-sum myth is this idea that progress for some of us comes at the expense of others. And in this case, and as what Dr. Kendi talks about, right, we're talking here about the progress for people of color coming at the expense of white folks, right?
Yeah.
And so I highlighted and want to share what Dr. Kendi says about the zero-sum myth. And then, I'm just so curious to hear what you have to say about all of this. So he says, I quote, "The zero-sum myth erases the past and present of abolitionist and anti-racist movements, which have aided ordinary white people. It fear-mongers about their future. If white people are not worshipped in schools, then they will be demonized. If white people don't reign supreme, then they will be subjugated. If white people don't hoard resources and opportunities, then they will be starved. If white people cannot kill at will, then they will be killed at will. white violence is presumed to be self-defense. Defending yourself against a white supremacist is presumed to be a criminal act. And yeah, I have so many thoughts about all of this, right? But I want to shut up and hear from you. But I just think there is mounds of evidence of this fear, right? Because what I read through a lot of that is fear, right? Or what I mean, he uses the word fear mongers, right? And fear, right? But there's a lot of fear in this, and that fear that he talks about, and I think it's manifested itself in so much of what we're seeing, what we've seen, and what we've talked about, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think that section really hits the nail on the head for me. I think so much of the kind of resistance that we're seeing to any kind of progress, however little, is based on this idea that somehow access and rights will somehow be cheapened or lessened for white people, or that, sort of revenge will be taken against white people or people in power. So, men or heterosexual people or what have you. I think it's also founded in this continued sense of control that's basically been present for anyone who isn't white or male or Christian or landowning since the beginning of this country, and also before, because we inherited a lot of legal ideas from other places. So yeah, it seems to be this idea that if folks who have been marginalized and subjugated begin to have rights, then they will, as I said, seek revenge.
Right.
And that's what that zero sum thing is for me. I think is like people think it's all or nothing. And I think in a way that's how it's kind of been presented to us for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And so
which is fascinating to think about it from, I can see that, but I can also sort of see the other side, and I know you can too, right? Of like, man, I just want some rights.
Yeah.
Man, right? Like some humanity. And when you're sitting on the other side of the table, right? Or you're just, if you have a heart and compassion and believe in this, right? To hear people just ask for sort of the basics. You're like, well, damn, that's not a lot.
No, it's
for.
not. It's not.
Yeah. Man.
Especially when you think about the way that we frame rights in the U.S. that are, not, it's mostly like the government won't do this to you. It's like, that's all I want.
Yeah,
those sort of 10 Bill of Rights. Can I just get those?
Yeah, please.
As a starting point.
Yes.
And then, so the way that he closes that quote about white violence being self-defense and defending yourself against a white supremacist is a criminal act, I think is also so on point, because there's so many examples, right? Like Trayvon Martin is an example, Oscar Grant is an example, and so many others. I named the two of them because they're who came to mind first as I was reflecting on that point. And the idea is central to white supremacist violence. It's a guiding principle.
Yeah.
Dylan Roof wanted to start a race war, right? The shooter in Texas at the Walmart wanted to attack immigrants, specifically because they felt like they were being attacked.
Yes.
And that they were losing their rights in some way. And so this is violent control that in their mind is actually self-defense against an attack on white people. And so, all of that like hits the nail on the head for me. And then one of the other things I wanted to talk about for a second is the sort of opposing or conflicting mantras of he ascribed it to the Republican Party.
Yep.
I think, or maybe conservatives.
It was Republicans.
I think they are conflicting on the surface. And I think that they're both ways to delegitimize anti-racist movement.
Oh, okay.
So the first one, which is that racism doesn't exist.
Yep.
Right. That discounts the need for anything to be done.
Right.
Because racism is over. So we don't need to do this.
Right.
We fixed this in the 60s.
Let's move on. Yeah.
And then the second one, that there is mounting racism against white people, sort of reverse racism, to borrow that term.
Yeah.
that undermines the relatively little things that have been done to try to address the racism embedded in the U.S.
Yes.
because it's so-called hurting people. So they seem to be contradictory, but I think they're basically two sides of the same coin that have been they get used in different ways, right?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a sort of a brilliant take on it, only because, like, and particularly for that second one, right? Like you're talking about sort of it undermining sort of the work that's been done to try to address. I think the key word you said there was try, right?
Yeah.
Because
it's been very half-hearted attempts.
my goodness.
But even the half-hearted attempts have drawn ire and backlash and right, all that and this, like, oh, now it's racist against white people.
Like what, right? Yeah. So I think there's a lot of good connections. I talked about fear. I think you sort of talked about this idea of power, right? And that's what sort of white folks are concerned about, potentially losing, right? Or some of those feelings in this. But I think it's pretty clear here how we sort of feel about that, and that this work is important. And we've got to continue, and we've got to talk about these things. So,
yes.
Yeah, I figured you might have some thoughts. Thank you for sharing. All right, well, let's shift and talk about application. Though, I don't know, what do you think? I think we've been talking about application this whole time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, this whole, I think that this article is, he's tying things together into the present day. Like he's connecting the dots, which I think is sort of the colloquial way to talk about application. Yeah. Maybe in the new year we should change the name of this section to Connecting the Dots.
Connecting the Dots. I like it. All right, you heard it here, folks, right? Yeah, I think I loved this piece. It sounds like you did too, right? I think there's just so much great work that he did to sort of, I think these things are so important, right? To name things like the notion of white supremacy and white supremacist ideology and anti-racism and sort of the manifestation of these things in action in our politics, in our education, right? And in our society, right? And again, connecting the dots between history and our present day, right? And I think what he did is a model for what we'd all should be doing, right? Like that's application work we can and should all be doing in our everyday lives, right? So what does that look like, I think, for each of us in our conversations that we're having, right? In our homes, with our families during this time of year where a lot of us are spending lots of time with family,
right?
In our workplaces, in our communities, right? I think Dr. Kendi in this article is compelling us to think about not only how important it is to know and understand our history, but also to sort of actively name these notions like white supremacy to work to dismantle them.
Yes. Yeah. I think my that's all great. Cosign. My ideas for application here, I think, are based on that first quote you shared about how we don't often know or recognize the foundational philosophies of white supremacy, which I think ties in, beautifully to what you just said too, especially when it's being mainstreamed in the way that it's being mainstreamed.
Yeah.
I think we need to understand these elements to see when they are operating. So, when Tucker Carlson is going off on a rant, we can point out how his rant is nonsense.
Yes.
And how it's founded in the Mantra or in the Turner Diaries, which is another whole white supremacist, like foundational kind of text, or whatever else. And we can track back the ideas, the origin of these ideas to violently radical white supremacist ideas, and then we can kind of undermine Tucker's rant in the first place, or whoever's rant in the first place. But that's also, right, like a lot of work. Yeah. Like I've been in places where I hear somebody say something, and I'm like, oh, that's like code.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a dog whistle. But it would take me probably 20 minutes to sit with you individually and explain how what you just said is connected to X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And so there's also like a limit in how we can do that. And so I think continuing to talk about it finding avenues to talk about it publicly, I think, is where my mind's at for kind of application.
I like that, the idea of
Which
talking about it publicly.
Ties into my homework, I think. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
let's go
I'm jumping
there.
ahead a little bit.
No, let's go there. I like it. No, I appreciate that. You know, you said this earlier. I just can't get out of my mind. This article was a word and a half. I love that.
Yeah.
Because it was. And I think, you know, that made me think about how I feel like we've read a couple of articles like this one where there are just lots of embedded links to places to go and to learn more. So in this article, for example, there's several links. There's a link to data from the Department of Education about the race and ethnicity of public school teachers and their students, right? And that was sort of in the part of the article where he was naming white people's fears around what kids are being taught in schools. So it sort of fit there.
Yeah.
Right?
Despite teachers, what it was like
79, 75,
74,
in the
70,
70s.
74, 79% of teachers being white.
White. Yep. Aha. There it is. There was another link, or there were links to both this idea of white backlash and this new thing that's out there called woke-lash.
Yeah.
Right? And so I didn't really get a chance to click on too many of the links. I thought I would have some time to go back and do it, and I did. And so my homework is to go back and check out some of those links. Because I think from the titles of the pieces alone that he linked to, some of them, I imagine that there is some really good stuff to sort of continue this conversation, but also just, you know, our ongoing learning work. So what about you? You hinted to something. What is it?
Yeah. Well, I think going back, and I'm always a fan of going back and clicking the links because I feel like I don't have time. I never have time when I'm like reading this to get ready for the podcast to like, dive into the footnotes. I do here and there, but not to the extent that I would like to. So that's great homework.
Let's do it.
But I think, you know, what I was alluding to earlier is I think some of our homework needs to be collectively figuring out how to undermine these arguments against critical race theory and against sort of publicly talking about racism in schools or in you know, the workplace or wherever it is, and trying to understand how racism is operating in the world around us, which is what they're trying to prevent us from doing. So whether that's like, you know, op-eds that lay out some key outcomes of an effective anti-racist education, or continuing to write and speak out in favor of teaching real history, wherever that might be. You know, one of my favorite concepts that I first heard from Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategies, but it's actually a quote from Grace Lee Boggs that she cites, is transform yourself to transform the world. And so we have to do this kind of work to learn things and unlearn things, and find ways to connect it to make changes in the world around us.
You know, Aaron, we've done this. What is this? Episode 48, which is incredible. I think that might be the best homework we've had.
Oh,
yeah.
thanks.
I don't know if someone's grading us, but like what I think
Well, we are apparently.
we are. So I'm grading it, and I've given you an A+. And I say that because this is real, right? Like this is happening right now, right? And so there are sort of two things that stuck out to me. One, this idea of like figuring out how we collectively undermine these ridiculous arguments against CRT, because we hear something new every day, right?
Every day.
Every day, right? But I also think about, it connects to what you said earlier around sort of really trying to sort of understand the sort of the philosophy behind this mantra of white supremacy, right? And to be able to talk about this and address it publicly with folks, right? And to be able to understand the codes and to be able, right? Like, I worry about where we are, right? And I think that's why we're doing this podcast, right? And we want to sort of transform society, as you sort of mentioned, transform the world. Excuse me. I mean, don't limit it to just society. And so I think there's some urgency, in the homework that you presented today, that I think has some real world, present day applicability and importance. So I don't know why it hit me, what you just said, in the way that it did, but best homework of the year.
Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, as you're riding the high of that praise, you're up next time, my friend. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
So, speaking of things that are going weird in our world, I'm going to bring a documentary called After Truth, Disinformation, and the Cost of Fake News to the table here.
Okay.
It's a documentary, as I said, that explores the implication of fake news on our society in the U.S. And it's on HBO Max if you would like to watch along with us. And it seems to be a really interesting dive into fake news, sort of the ways that it's generated. I watched the trailer, and there's this one moment where somebody tweets out, like takes a picture of something outside of the building, tweets something out about it, and then that was real. But he had no evidence. He just made up something about like a bus that was outside. So
Okay.
he just had a following on Twitter and took advantage of it essentially, and it became a thing.
Yeah.
But they also talk about Comet Pizza and the Pizzagate, the fake scandal that led to like real outcomes and a real person taking a rifle to sort of free children they believe were trapped in the basement of a building that doesn't have a basement and were being kept there for a sex ring. And so, it's a dive into all of this and what it's doing to us collectively.
Wow. Well, and we've heard the term fake news so much over the past 4 or 5 years, right? So I think there's some, that's important to talk about. And this idea of journalism too. I think we've had a number of episodes where we've talked about sort of the power of, I mean, even today, if you want to call Tucker Carlson journalism, right? It's news, right? It's a news commentary show, right? So, the power of journalism in spreading ideas around social justice and collective liberation is important. So, I hadn't heard of this documentary, so I'm looking forward to watching it and talking about it with you. Very good. All right, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with all the people in your life. Please follow us on social media. You can check us out on YouTube. And of course, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.